Hello everyone, how are you today? Welcome back to Language Testing and Assessment course. Are you there with me? Yeah, so this is the second lesson of the course. In the previous lesson, I introduced to you some main content of the course, and we talked about the relationship between teaching and learning and testing. And we talk about washback, beneficial and harmful washback of testing on teaching and learning. We also talk about inaccurate tests. In order for a test to have beneficial washback, the results it produces or provides should be accurate. And we also talk about different types of tests and testings. For the types of tests, we talk about the purposes, and for different types of testing, we talk about the approaches to test construction. After the session, you also did some practices analyzing the washback of your test or the test you are familiar with, and analyze the purposes, the types, and to decide whether the tests are communicative or not. I received about 43 responses from you from QH 2019-2, and I don't know what happened to others. Some of you didn't send me the responses. So in today's lesson, we will look at validity and reliability, which are the two important qualities of a test. Last time we talked about accuracy of a test. So in order to have accurate results of a test, the test must be valid and reliable. So in other words, validity and reliability are the two very important features of a good test. So first, we talk about validity, and then after that, we will have a short break and we will continue with reliability. So what is validity? What are different forms of validity? And how can the validity of a test be measured? And the last question, which is quite important, is how to make homemade tests more valid. So can you answer the first question? What is test validity? So test validity is extent to which a test accurately measures what it is supposed to measure. In language, we often talk about constructs, theoretical constructs, such as proficiency or ability of different types, like reading ability or writing ability, or also we talk about different constructs such as fluency or different abilities, different types of abilities or skills. So a test is valid if it can measure the constructs, the language constructs that it is supposed to measure. In other words, we say the test validity is the extent to which inferences are made from assessment results are appropriate, meaningful, and useful in terms of the purpose of the assessment. So that's what test validity is. And we can say that a valid test measures exactly what it is supposed to measure. A valid test does not measure irrelevant variables, and a valid test relies as much as possible on empirical evidence, such as the informants of the students or of the test takers, and it involves performance that samples the test criterion, like the objective of a course, for example. A valid test offers useful, meaningful information about a test taker's ability, and it is supported by a theoretical rationale or argument. So, for example, a reading test is valid if it measures a student's or the test taker's reading ability. You have to give the test taker a reading passage or reading text, ask them to read and find out whether they understand, they can get information, they can understand the text thoroughly. A writing test is valid if when you measure the writing ability of the test taker instead of just finding out their ability to remember words or to use grammatical structures. So that's the concept of test validity. And we can say that test validity is a matter of degree, the degree not invalid or valid, not yes or no, but test validity can be measured according to the different degrees. And there's no final absolute measure of validity, but there are several kinds of evidence that may be invoked in support the validity of a test. So we say they are the subordinate forms of validity. Yeah. So we move on with the different types of evidence or different subordinate forms of validity of a test. What are they? First, we have the content validity, criterion-related validity, validity in scoring, and phase validity, to name just a few forms of validity of a test. But these are the major forms, the main forms of validity of a test. Talking about content validity, what is content validity? So, content of a test should constitute a representative sample of language skills, structures, etc. to be tested. We say that a test is content valid if it has a sample of the structures or the skills that it aims to measure in the students or in the test takers. And if we want to make a test content valid, we should have a specification of the skills or structures of the test. The skills or structures that the test is intended to cover, then we make it at the very beginning of the stage of test construction. For example, if you want to make an achievement test of a course, you have to list out all the skills, grammatical structures, vocabulary, functions, language functions you have taught in the course. So everything you have to write down. That is a specification of the test. And after that, you will choose from the list of skills, the list of notions or functions or structures or vocabulary to include in the test. So we can say that the specification provides test constructor the basis for making a principled selection of the elements to be included in the test. Of course, you can't test everything you have taught in a course or everything that the students have learned in a course, but you have to list all of them, and you choose the most important or the major or the most important functions or structures or skills to be included in the test. So, how to judge content validity of a test? You can judge content validity of a test by comparing test specification and the content of the test. To find out whether the content of the test match or matches the content of the specification, and how much of the content of the specification is covered in the test. Content validity is important. Why? Because it contributes to the construct validity of the test. It is one of the most important forms of validity of a test. And if the content is not selected from from what the test is intended to measure, then the test will have a harmful watchback on teaching and learning. The areas that are not tested may be ignored in teaching and learning. For example, you teach four language skills: listening, reading, speaking, and writing. But in the test, you just measure the student's ability to read and to listen and to use some grammatical structures and to understand some vocabulary. Then, of course, the speaking and writing skills will be ignored or neglected by the teacher and students as well. In that way, the test can have a very harmful watchback or effect on teaching and learning. A test can claim content-related evidence of validity if it samples the subject matter about which conclusions are to be drawn. So it tests the real cause objective, and it requires a test taker to perform the behavior that is being measured. So here the story is about direct or indirect testing. There's always a struggle between reliability and validity, and in the direct and indirect testing. If you test indirectly, you may not be able to measure what you want to measure. Some productive skills of the students or ability to use language by the students or test takers. So the validity is quite low. So normally, when you want your test to be valid or highly valid in terms of content, you should use direct testing, especially for the skills and the use of language. And now we move on to the next type or next form of validity, of test validity, which is criterion-related validity. So what is it? We can say that the degree to which results on a test agree with those provided by some independent and highly dependable assessment of the candidate's ability. For example, another test or the teacher's assessment, of course, the assessment must be reliable and dependable. Or we can compare the result of the test with the results of the later study of the test takers. So criterion here refers to the result of another test or another form of assessment, or the result of the study of the test taker after they take the test. So for criterion-related validity, we have two different forms. The first one is concurrent validity, and the second one is predictive validity. So what is concurrent validity? For concurrent validity, test and criterion are administered at the same time. And criterion for concurrent validity can be a test or a teacher's assessment. Let me take an example. So you can give the students a final or end of course test, and you have the results. And if you want to find out whether your test is criterion related, valid, you compare the results of the test with the results of the student of the assessment, of continuous assessment, different forms of continuous assessment. If the results are similar, you can say that the final or the end of course test is criterion related valid. And if the results of the continuous assessment and those of the end of course test are quite different, we may have some doubt about the validity of the test. So we can decide on the this form of validity of the test by giving two different tests. The example is about testing different functions in the course. For example, in the course, you teach a lot of language functions, explaining, giving directions, describing processes, reading, criticizing, a lot of them in one course. And in a test, in an oral test, speaking test, you can't ask the students to perform all of the functions that you have taught them because of time limit. So you can ask them to perform just a few from the list of functions that they have learned in the course. So how can you decide whether that test, that short test, is valid? So you can make a comparison. You design a 10-minute test which asks the students to perform 2 or 3 functions only. And you also design a test, quite long, in which test takers or your students are asked to perform all of the functions that they have learned in the course. And then you compare, you make a comparison between the results of the two forms of test, the 10-minute test and the long test with all the functions performed. And if the results, the scores are similar, or there's not much difference between the two sets of scores, you can say that the short test is valid enough. So it's how concurrent validity can be measured. And for predictive validity, we talk about predictive validity when we talk about the ability of the test to predict whether the test taker will be successful or not in later study. So we often we are concerned about this for placement tests or for tests that decide whether the students can be admitted to a university course or not. The degree to which a test can predict candidates' future performance is related to predictive validity. And criterion measure can be assessment by the teacher, the outcome of the course. If you give the students a test and the results of the test are used for placing students in different groups or categorizing students, and after some time, after they study in the course for some time, you can find out whether their ability to do the course matches with the results of the test. Or you use a test to decide whether the students will be able to continue studying in a university program. And after the students finish the first semester, for example, you can compare the results of that semester with the results of the test they took before, and see if the test the results of the test match with the results of their studies in the semester. If they match well, we can see that the test has a predictive validity or highly predictive validity. And how to measure criterion-related validity? So if you want to measure the criterion-related validity, as I mentioned before, you just compare the results of the test that you use with some other forms, the results of some other forms of assessment, or the results of the later study of the student. And then you can have what is called correlation coefficient or validity coefficient. And the degree of agreement is from 1 to 0. So if the correlation coefficient or validity coefficient of a test is 1, it is highly criterion-related validity. It has a high degree of validity. And if the correlation coefficient is 0, which means there's no match between the test results and the criterion, and we can say that the degree of validity is very, very low, 0. Now, let's move on to phase validity. But phase, the name of this type of validity can tell you a lot about it, right? So phase validity just refers to degree to which a test looks or appears to measure the knowledge or the skills or the ability it claims to measure. This is quite a subjective judgment, normally by test takers or test users or administrators. There's no scientific evidence for this type of validity. It's all about feeling. It's all about just the impression of individuals, test takers or users. But this type of validity is quite important. Why? Why is phase validity, even though it's not scientific, it doesn't have a scientific evidence, it's not scientific evidence based, it's still important? Because phase validity can have test takers feel confident or believe in the test that they are taking. So this is a kind of psychological state of test takers that is important. If the test takers take a test and they think that the test does not measure their ability to, for example, if they take a writing test and they think that this writing test doesn't measure their writing ability, then they may not concentrate, or they may not try hard to do the test well, and they may get bored, etc. So phase validity is quite important for test takers and also important for test users. Maybe that's the first reason or the first condition for a test user to decide, to choose to use the test for their students. So that's about phase validity. And we also have a validity in scoring. This is quite simple. Validity in scoring. So even though the test is valid, the content of the test is valid, and the test has a criterion-related validity, if the scoring is not valid, then the results of the test are not reliable or are not useful, cannot provide useful and meaningful information because they won't reflect the true ability of the test takers. So, what is validity in scoring? Validity in scoring is the scorers should score or mark the test according to the aim or the objectives of the test. For example, when you score or when you mark a reading paper by the students in which there are items that ask the students to give short responses, what scorers will have to do is to check whether the responses are correct or not on the spelling or grammar mistake of the responses. Because if the scorer pays a lot of attention to grammar or spelling mistakes, then reading comprehension is neglected, and then the results may not reflect the ability to read by the student. I heard a very funny story about testing young children. So the teacher gave the students a test to check their ability to understand vocabulary, words. And instead of writing down the words, the students had to draw. And one teacher just said that the drawing, the students listened to different vocabulary of trees, plants, animals, and they had to draw. And the teacher just gave the students marks on their drawings. And one student couldn't draw very well, and he got bad marks just for the drawings, even though he could draw like a cat or flower, but the drawings were not beautiful enough. So he didn't get good marks for the drawing. So in that way, we say that the scoring is not valid, because instead of checking whether the students knew the words, understood the words that they heard, the teacher just gave marks on the students' ability to draw. So that's not valid scoring. Or sometimes in an oral test, instead of assessing and giving marks or scores on the students' ability to speak, the examiners may be impressed by the examinee's appearance and may give marks or the scores or the marks the examiners give the examinees might be influenced by the behavior or by the appearance of the test takers or examinees. So that's invalidity in scoring. And so we know that validity of a test is important. So being teachers, what can you do to make your test more valid? It's quite simple, like what I mentioned before. So the first thing we have to do when we start writing or preparing or constructing a test is to write explicit specification for the test. Excuse me. In the specification, we have to take account of all that is known about the construct that are to be measured. For example, if you want to measure the student's speaking ability is a construct, a language construct. So what does speaking ability consist of? Ability to pronounce words correctly, ability to use complex and appropriate vocabulary, ability to make connections between different ideas or ability to use expressions appropriately in different contexts, etc. So what is speaking ability? You have to break it down and you have to list it in the specification so that you can choose some or most of these elements of speaking abilities to be included in the test. And now, after you have, or when you prepare a test for end of term test, for example, like what I mentioned before, you have to list down all the things that the students are supposed have learned in the course. You have to based on the course objectives or the course content to make the specification. And after that, you choose or you select a representative sample of the content in the specification to be included in the test. As I also mentioned before, we can't just test everything the students have learned or have been supposed to have learned. So you just choose the most important ones or the representative sample of those to be included in the test. So the selection should be very careful so that important points should not be missed, and the sample should be reasonable, not too little, not too much. Because if you take a big sample of the content of the specification, the test may be too long, and that is not practical at all, because a too long test may you don't have a time for too long tests, and also a long test can make the students tired and can result in low level of reliability. But if the sample is too small, then it does not reflect the real content that you want to measure, or the full ability of the students that you want to measure. So we should have a very reasonable representative sample of the content in the specification of the test. And in order to make a test valid, we have to use direct testing. If you want to test a student's speaking ability, we don't use multiple choice, or we don't use dialogue completion in written form, but we have to ask the students to speak. It means we have to use speaking test, ask the students to speak, we have an interview with them, we ask them questions for them to answer, we ask them to give a monologue or get them involved in dialogues or conversations, etc., so that we can measure directly the students' speaking ability. Similarly, with the writing test, if we want to measure students' writing ability, ask them to write a passage, write an essay, a text, etc., instead of asking them to decide to do a multiple choice, deciding whether the sentences, which of the sentences has closest meaning with the original sentence, or asking them to match or to reorder text. So these are not, this form cannot measure directly and correctly, accurately the student's ability to write. Next, we have to make sure that the scoring of the responses relates directly to what is being tested. It is about scoring validity. So, like I mentioned before, scoring a writing test shouldn't focus too much on spelling or on handwriting of the paper, but should be on the criteria that are listed for the piece of writing. And the last one, if you want to make a test valid, you have to make it reliable. And how to make the test reliable? Test reliability will be the next topic that we will talk about. But before that, look at the practice 3. So you will have to look again at the test you have analyzed. Many of you have analyzed some tests. Some of you have even analyzed 2 or 3 tests. So look at them again and assess the test in terms of various forms of validity, whether the test is content validity or criterion related validity or the face validity, and what evidence is there that the test is valid. Do you have any evidence that the test you are analyzing is valid? And if there's no evidence, so how would you set about gathering the evidence? So that's the practice for you to do after today's session. So you will do it individually also, and you will send it to your monitor, and the monitor will collect all of these and send to me. Thank you. And now we have a short break, and after that we will talk about test reliability. And during the break, if you want to have any questions, or if there's anything that's not clear about the content of about validity, what I will just said to you, please, you can raise questions, and I can answer them now or later if I can. Okay, so have a short break. Hello, welcome back to our session. During the break, I got a question from one of you, Mr. I don't know the real name, but it's about, could you say the example of the speaking test again? Because I could not hear clearly the part how to make a test valid. So for a speaking test, of course, if you want the test to be valid, you have to use direct test. Instead of asking the students to do the jumbo text, like putting the different turns in a conversation in the right order, matching or gap filling, you have to ask the students to speak, or the test takers to speak, in order to measure their ability to speak or speaking ability. So sometimes because of the test taking conditions or of the time, or for a larger scale test, indirect testing has to be used, but the results may not reflect truly the speaking ability of the students. So there are 2 things that teachers should remember in order to make that test valid. First, you have to make a specification. For example, if you want to test speaking, what ability of speaking do you want to test? The ability to perform some functions, or the ability to discuss some topics, or the ability to debate. And then you have to list down all the elements of the ability to like a debate or to give a speech, and then you will write a direct test. Ask them to give a speech, or ask them to debate, or ask them to discuss a topic. In that way, you can directly measure the student's ability to do these things. Yes, that is the first thing that you should do to make sure that your test is valid. And the second thing you have to do is the scoring. When you score the student's speaking ability, you don't give marks, or you don't give some bonus point on the student's appearance, or on the student's behavior, or on how quick the students can respond to your questions. But you have to stick to the criteria you said before, what you want to measure about the student's speaking abilities, and the criteria to measure these abilities. So, two things that you should bear in mind in order to make your test, speaking test, valid. First, make specification, and then select the a representative sample of the specification to be included in the test. Second, score validly. So these are the two things that teachers can do to make their speaking test valid. Okay? So I've got only one question from you. And what about others? If there's any idea or concept that is not clear to you, you can just type your question and I will answer them later. You can ask questions in English or in Vietnamese. Okay. And now let's move on to our next part of today's session, which is about test reliability. What is test reliability? So the name or the word can tell us a lot about this. Reliable, can be relied on, and reliability. So test reliability is a degree to which a test is considered consistent and stable in measuring what it is intended to measure. Quite simple. So if a test is given to the same group of students at different time under the same condition, the results are similar, then we say that the test is reliable, or the degree of reliability of the test is quite high. But if the same test is given to the same group of students at different times, under the same condition, and we get two different sets of results that are not similar, or not similar enough, then we say that the test is not reliable. So that's about test reliability. And what are the factors that can contribute to the test unreliability? There are different factors, you know. The first factor comes from the student or the test takers themselves. The second one, the rater reliability, it means the scorer. And the next one, test administration and the test itself. So I just named just 4 factors that may contribute to the unreliability of a test. First, look at the student-related reliability. You know, students are human beings, so they may be in different moods or different health state at different times. So, for example, illness, or they may have some problem that make them distract from the test. So, if the same student takes the same test at different times, the second time may be interfered with the students' health state. They may be or they may have some problem to worry about, so that may affect the result of the test. And what about rater reliability? Here we talk about the scorers. Reliability can be inter-rater or intra-rater. If two scorers mark the same paper, the chance is that the results are not the same, especially for the productive, the test of productive skills like speaking and listening. And that is about inter-rater reliability. In order to have to achieve inter-rater reliability, we have to use a very detailed marking scale. The raters or the scorers should be explained very thoroughly, carefully about the criteria for marking the papers. And they may have to discuss before so that they can reach a high degree of achievement, so that the results of the scorers are not different. And intra-rater, the same person marks or scores the same papers at different times may have a different results. That's because the judgment of the scorer may differ at different times. So sometimes we give the same scorer some papers to mark again, and we match the two sets of results, the first time and the second time, and see if there's agreement between the two sets of results, the two sets of scores. And if the agreement is high, we can say that intra-rater reliability is high. But if the results of the two times are different or quite different, then intra-rater reliability is low. The next factor that may interfere with the test reliability is administration. If the test is in the first time is administered in a good condition, but the second time is administered in a room where there's a lot of noise, or small room with stuffy and hot, for example, then the results might be different. So we can say that test administration may interfere or may lower the reliability of a test in that way. And the last factor, the test itself. The testing type, like a direct or indirect, some items are ambiguous, or instructions are not clear, or the timing, maybe the time is too long that makes the students tired, or the time to reading, for example. So some students are not good at doing things under pressure, so they cannot have good results for timed reading. But the results of that test does not truly reflect their ability to read. So these are the four main factors that may interfere with the test reliability, that may make the test unreliable. That's about the factors. And how about quantifying the reliability of a test? So we know that in order to decide whether a test is reliable or not, we have to make a comparison between the two sets of scores. So the result of the comparison is what is called coefficient. reliability coefficient. And like a validity coefficient, reliability coefficient ranges from 1 to 0. So if the coefficient is 1, it means two sets of results are precisely the same. And if the result, or if the coefficient is 0, we can say that two sets of results are quite unconnected, which means the test is not reliable at all. Why we have how can we have two sets of results to compare? There are different methods. The first method that has been used for quite a long time is test-retest method. The second one, alternate forms method, and the third one, split-half method. So, what is test-retest method? You administer a test to a group of students, and after some time, you ask the same group of students to do the same test again. That is test-retest method. And then you have two sets of scores, and you can make comparisons and see if there's agreement between the two sets of scores or not. Test and retest method has some disadvantages. You know, if the interval time, the time between the two tests is too short, the students or the test takers may remember something about the test, remember the questions, they remember the answers, and that may make the results unreliable, because that is not about their ability, that's about their memory. And if the interval time between the two tests is too long, then we are not sure whether during that time the students will have learned something more. They will have they have learned new things, and their ability is different. Their proficiency has been improved. So the results are not truly reflected or do not truly reflect the ability of the students. And we can't say that when we compare the two sets of results, we can say that some variables have interfered with the results. So we can't decide the degree of reliability of the test anymore. And what about alternate forms? Alternate form method is used to reduce the disadvantages of test-retest method, but it's difficult to do that. Alternate forms, you use the same test, but just one test, but then you design another test with the same, with similar forms, and you administer to the students. So it's also difficult to have an alternate form of the test. The last method is often used now because it can reduce the disadvantages of the other two methods. That is split-half method. With this method, the students will have to do a long test, but half of the test is scored only, and the other half is used for making comparison. For example, a test that has 100 items, so 50 of the items are used for assessing the student's ability, and the other 50 items are just used for making comparison between the other half and the other half of the test to decide the level of reliability of the test. So that's how we can have two sets of scores to make comparison to decide on the degree of the reliability of the test. Why reliability of the test important? Normally, it is believed that the actual score of the student or of the test taker does not always reflect the true score. It means reflect the true ability of the test taker. This will lead to maybe wrong decisions, or this will lead to difficulty in making decisions about the students. So the test must be reliable so that the true score and the actual score must be close, quite close, or similar. And also, a test must be reliable because a valid test must be reliable. The test must be reliable in order to increase the degree of validity of the test. And reliability, in other words, is a condition for validity. A reliable test is consistent in its conditions across two or more administrations. So consistent here, we want to talk about the consistency in the results. Two or more administrations of the same test yield consistent results. So if the test wants to be reliable, it must give clear directions for scoring or evaluation. And it must have uniform rubrics for scoring or evaluation. It lends itself to consistent application of those rubrics by the scorer and contains items or tasks that are not ambiguous to the test taker. So if the test has all these features, we can say that it is reliable. Now the next question is how to make a test more reliable, especially for teachers. How to make your test more reliable? First, take enough samples of behavior. What does it mean? The more items the test has, the more reliable it will be. So, if you use a very short test, you can't have a true or a reflection or true information or sufficient information about the learners or test takers' ability. And normally we have to add more items. Of course, the items should be independent of each other. Well, we call them fresh stats to increase test ability. And also, the test shouldn't be too long, because if the test is too long, it will make the test takers tired and boring. So here, you have to consider very carefully in order to have the right length of the test. It depends on the specification. If the content that you want to measure is too much, it is too much, of course, you have to consider taking a large sample. And if the content that you want to, the content of the specification is not much, you can have a smaller sample. So the first principle is to take enough samples of behavior. Second, exclude items which do not discriminate well. Here we talk about discriminating ability of items. If items that strong students and weak students can perform with similar degree of success, we can say that they do not discriminate well. weak students can do it, strong students can do it, well, then these items may be too easy or too difficult. Too easy, everybody can do it, or too difficult, nobody can do it. So these items should be excluded from the test. However, in some tests, we can use some easy or non-discriminating items at the beginning of a test to encourage candidates, to give candidates confidence, more confidence, to reduce stress from candidates. And these non-discriminating items are usually easy ones. So test begins with easy items, can have reduce stress or anxiety from test takers. However, we shouldn't abuse all these non-discriminating items. Just use few of them, 2 or 3 of them only. And other non-discriminating items should be removed from the test. So how can you decide that items are non-discriminating? So of course we have to pilot the test, and then we do some statistical analysis and find out whether the items are non-discriminating, or whether the items can discriminate test takers well or not. That is the second. Third, do not allow candidates too much freedom. So there are some tests that gives candidates options. Write an essay about one of the 3 topics, for example. You give the students a lot of freedom to make choice, to choose the questions to do. Then this may interfere with the reliability of the test. And also, the range of possible answers can interfere with the reliability of the test. If there are questions that can have more than one acceptable answers, then students will the reliability of the test can be reduced. And number 4, write unambiguous items. Ambiguous items, what are they? They are items that can be understood in different ways. So you have to avoid them. Items with unclear meaning, which can be interpreted in different ways on different occasions. And in order to eliminate ambiguous items, you have to do something. What? You just write the items and then give them to your colleagues. Ask them to read carefully, and they will find out whether the items can be understood in different ways, can be interpreted in different ways. Or you can pilot the items. You give the items to a small groups of students or test takers, ask them to do, and ask them to find out whether the items are clear enough, or there are items that are ambiguous, unclear, that can be understood in different ways, and then you remove all of them. Yes, that is number 4. And number 5, provide clear and explicit instructions, oral or written. So you have to make sure that candidates or test takers know exactly what they are asked to do. And you have to avoid carelessly worded instructions. You assume that the students often do this type of test and they know what they are supposed to do, and you don't write very careful instructions. So that may make the students misunderstand the instruction, make them confused or upset about what they have to do. So the point here is you have to make very clear instructions all the time. Sometimes some instructions can be misinterpreted, and not by weak students, but often by better students or better candidates. So the instructions should be simple but clear enough for everyone to understand. And for oral test, the listening test, the spoken instructions should be read from a prepared text to avoid confusion. Yeah. So that is number 5. The next, number 6, you have to ensure that tests are well laid out. We talk about the format of the test and perfectly legible. If the photocopies of the papers, of the test papers, make some letters difficult to read, then it may interfere with the reliability of the result. Or if there are there's too much text in a small space, it's very difficult, or the letters are too small to read, or the letters are badly typed, then the reliability of the test may be lowered. Number 7, make candidates familiar with format and testing techniques. So you can distribute sample tests or ask the students do some past test papers, or some practice tests that has similar format and techniques that you will use in the official test, so that the candidates understand the format and they are familiar with the test techniques. That will help them do the test better. If they have a difficulty understanding the test format or the technique, so the result of the test might not reflect their true ability to use the language or the ability to read or to write, but the ability to figure out the format or the test techniques. For number 8, we have to provide uniform and non-distracting testing conditions with no interference of outside noise, or the timing should be specific and should be kept strictly and clear and carefully. That's about test taking conditions. 9. Use items that allow scoring which is as objective as possible. So this is a conflict to the validity, which mandates that test should be direct. And if test is direct, like writing or speaking, a lot of subjective judgment is involved, then the scoring is not objective enough. So this is a struggle between reliability and validity. You know that in order to have a reliable results of the test, the scoring should be objective. So for scoring to be objective, we should use like a multiple choice or test questions that involve the list of the subjective judgment of the test scorers. So we use multiple choice items or short responses for a reading, for example. The shorter the better. One word response, for example, or not more than 3 words response to some questions in a reading text, for example. So try to reduce the involvement of the scorer's subjective judgment in order to increase the reliability of the test results. What about number 10? That is, provide a detailed scoring key. This is very important. In order to increase the inter-rater reliability and also intra-rater reliability, we should have a very detailed scoring key or marking scheme in which we have to anticipate all possible responses, all acceptable responses, and assign points for acceptable answers. Some answers are partially correct. Shall we accept that? Shall we give points to them? So we have to be very clear at the beginning before scoring the papers. Yes, so that's number 10. And we have some more things to do to make the test more reliable. So scorers should be trained, and scorers should meet together to agree on acceptable responses and appropriate scores for the acceptable responses at the very beginning of scoring. And one thing which is also very important is to identify candidates by numbers, not names, to avoid the bias. And the last one, employ multiple independent scoring so that the test papers are scored and rescored so that no errors are made. So these are the ways that we have to do to make the test more reliable. There are 14 of them altogether, from the preparation of the test to administration of the test to scoring, to avoid the factors that affecting the reliability of the test. 2 factors that I mentioned before at the beginning of this part, student-related factor and test factor, the test itself, administration, and rater-related factors. So these are all about the content for today's lesson. In today's session, we talk about validity, what it is. We also talk about how to measure different types of validity and how to make a test more valid. As the second part of today's session, we talk about reliability, what it is, why is it important, and how to make a test more reliable. I hope that you will be able to apply many of these things that we talked about today in your own testing and your own teaching. For practice of this session, you look at your own institutional tests, or just one test, and see how reliable it is and how you could improve its reliability. Okay, so you will do it in written. You will write out the answers, and then you will also send the answer to your monitor, and your monitor will send it to me. The next session is on Sunday, right? if I remember correctly. It's on next Sunday. So try to send me the responses or your home assignment before that on Friday. Okay. Now, if you have any questions, you can type it down and send to me, and I will be very happy to answer the question in the next session, or I will reply you by email. Okay. Goodbye for now. Have a nice Sunday.